These disciples with Jesus on the road, walking, talking, learning, and they still never, ever seem to get it. I don't know, it's like a constant rebooting or updatings of a computer system that don't seem to ever go away. It just keeps going on and on and on. Inevitably, it's whenever you need it most. And these disciples have been with Jesus. They've been able to hear him teach. They see him teach. They understand. I mean, they're as close to him as we are. Day in and day out, they live, they eat, they learn. They go through life together. And still, somehow, in the midst of all that, they still don't get it. Makes me find a little comfort in that for myself. When I get fairly frustrated at myself or not following after the way that Jesus would call us to do and love people and share and give and hope and trust and all the stuff that gets in our way from being those good disciples. Get a little grace from the disciples themselves. Jesus in the Gospel of Mark keeps going after the injustices and the wrong-headed thinking of the disciples, especially in this chapter. It just keeps going. It's like they don't get it. Who's the greatest? Jesus. Who's the greatest in your kingdom? And Jesus brings children up and blesses them. The disciples don't interrupt Jesus. You're not that important. And what does Jesus do? He takes them into his lap, blesses them. And these disciples, who's the greatest of us? Can one of us sit on your right and one of us sit on the left? It's covered in different gospels in different ways, but it's really the same thing. Who's great? Who's able? Who's the most important? They've been able to hear straight from Jesus' mouth, straight from Jesus' teaching, and they still don't get it. What is it that keeps Jesus from just going off, just giving up, getting frustrated, taking the disciples and just shaking them a little bit? Come on, can't you get it? Perhaps that's a little bit what's at work here, but also perhaps this gospel writer wants to include these stories to make sure that we later, and we, the church, see the different perspective and don't continue to live into the way of the world, the way that world judges success and what's important and who's important, and how some get left behind so that others can move to the top. Oh, perhaps that's part of this understanding, is to make sure that we know over and over again that we are all God's beloved children, that we are all God's beloved people. God cares for each of us in our own unique way that we need most. God is there and God is faithful for us to bring us into the kingdom and to bring that kingdom experience into our lives so that God's grace and God's love and God's hope and God's trust can take root in our lives, and that we see that growing in and through us into the world. Not that the world in its way begins to dig into us and to see us as less than, or to see us as more important than others, but to see us begin to share God's love with other people and other places. A trust and a hope that's different than just the normal ho-hum of living. Oh, these disciples, bless their hearts, they just don't get it. Which one of us is the greatest? In the Gospel of Matthew, they actually try to get the disciples a little bit further away from it, and it's their mother that asks Jesus, oh, which one of these sons, which ones of my sons are going to sit on your left and on your right? And yet the answer that Jesus gives is very similar to this answer in Mark. Very similar. Perhaps it's a different situation, and the Gospel of Matthew editor and writer is beginning to try to distance just a little bit from the apostles. You just don't want them to make look that bad. And yet Mark, I always love Mark. It's one of the earliest Gospels written. I always say it's the Gospel in a hurry. If you don't know about Jesus' life and what he's done and how he teaches and what he says, Gospel of Mark is a quick way to learn and understand. It's shorter. In our hurry culture that we live in today, that may be a good place to start. Mark 1, Mark 16. But yet, in Mark, the disciples really have a lot more of this kind of human nature to them. They aren't given in the same light as perhaps Matthew or even Luke. They're really kind of salt of the earth people. And in a way, with the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is too. Jesus is most human in the Gospel of Mark. We haven't begun to place on him the understanding and the fullness of being Christ and what that means. This is Jesus, the human, Jesus, the gift of God that's given to the world, Jesus, the Messiah, but don't tell. We don't want people to know in the Gospel of Mark. But Jesus is beginning to change and to work a difference in the world. But how hard it is for the disciples to take that in to their being, to take it into their lives and to begin to transform their lives in a way that'll make a difference in the world. Oh, man, Jesus, I know he got frustrated. I know he'd hoped for so much more. It's like the beginning of the first day of school for a class, and a teacher sits in front and they look out, and I always love this line. The teachers always said this: everyone in this class has an A at this point. I'm like, have you seen my grades from last semester? I'm probably still trying to average it upwards. But everybody has an A at this point. We're starting out on the high ground. And the teacher went on to say, and it's your opportunity to bring down your grade. And you're like, what in the world are you talking about? But there's just kind of like this Jesus perhaps looked at the disciples and said, well, we want you to go far and to do well, to change the world. And yet the disciples, they just can't let their humanness go. They just can't let the stuff that is their normal. They can't get well, you'll succeed if you, and you'll be brave if you'll, and if you'll do this, you will. They can't change the way they've thought for so long. And to see this kingdom that's beginning to crack open and to bear face in the world, taking root in Jesus' life. They just clung to what they knew. The Gospel of Mark says that perhaps the church needs to hear this again. That's why, this Gospel's written a little bit later. The church and the thing called church had begun to move some. It was a movement. And perhaps while they put these gospel stories right here, bam, 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 take up your cross and follow after me. Who's the greatest? It's not who you think it is. It's a bunch of kids. Who's going to be the place of honor? Right and left. You just don't get it. It's more about Jesus and the church transforming the world than it is the world transforming the church and transforming us as Christians. Oh, it's pretty easy to look around in commercials. I love commercials. They tell me everything under the sun's going to make my life better if I just buy that product. And yet, what happens? That toothpaste is going to make me smile brighter than the 1,000 rays of sunshine. And everybody's just going to love to see me smile if I'll just buy that toothpaste. And what happens after just a little while? I don't really notice that much difference in my teeth. Maybe they want me to use more of the toothpaste. But I do know that the tube gets awfully empty. Transformation doesn't happen like they say. But now, this gospel stuff, the church has been around for a couple thousand years. And one would think that if we heard what Jesus said, that we did what Jesus told us to do, that we cared and loved others that we were called to, that the world would look mighty, mighty different. And yet we find that there's still struggle and strife all throughout the world and our nation. Injustices based on race and class, economic disparity when some people make millions and millions of dollars a year and others that can barely get $12 an hour or $15 an hour. I saw this thing that said that the other day. It said in North Carolina that I think it was $18 an hour was the bare minimum that you could make and be able to afford a basic apartment in our country, in our state. How do you do that on a $12 or $7.25 an hour job? Pretty impossible. Now, there's all kinds of these injustices. There's struggles. There are places, if you're looking for evidence that things are not perfect in the world, you don't have to go very far. And yet, over and over again, part of what it calls for us to do as being Christians, and part of what it calls us to do as to be followers after Christ, is to look at the world squarely in the eyes and to say that's not the way it's meant to be. The kingdom of God is different. The kingdom of God is hopeful. The kingdom of God brings transformation. The way that I see you, the way that I love you, the way that I care for you is different because of the Christ that's in me. Not because of my wonderful disposition or fake artificial hope, but because Jesus is in me and I care for the world in a different way. Care for Jesus. I care for the world the way Jesus cares for me. And the problem with that is that it begins to take root in my life and in my heart and in the way that I hope and trust. And it says to me that I'm to care for others as Christ cares for them, and just as Christ cares for me. It's awfully hard to be mad at a person when you look at them and you think that it's Christ on the other side. It's awfully hard to wish somebody bad when you've got the love of Jesus in your heart, taking root and changing things. No, it doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect and hunky-dory, and we're not going to get aggravated and frustrated. But it does mean because Christ living within us, we see with a different perspective. We see with different eyes. We love with different feelings. Oh, one of the things that I love most about United Methodism and Methodist theology is the very idea that it's a continuation of a decision to follow after Christ based in God's gift of grace to us. Our decision to follow after Christ is not a once saved, always saved kind of theology. In United Methodist understanding, it is a conscious decision that we make on a regular basis, daily, hourly, minute by minute, this decision to follow after Christ. To change our perspective, to change our hope, to change our trust, to continue to nurture that and sustain that and strengthen that. Y'all know I love to garden, and I think the reason why is that if you, quote one of my professors, get good plants, put them in good dirt, and care for them with good water, then you'll have a nice plant, a nice flower, a nice bloom, a nice growth. He said preaching is, you never know how it's going to turn out. But I know just from the garden, the way the garden teaches me, that you can't always just set a plant out and leave it alone. It doesn't matter how good a plant or how big a plant or what kind of plant you get. you can't just set it out in the ground and forget about it. You have to nurture it and sustain it. Early on, you have to water them more frequently. Every once in a while, you need a little fertilizer with it. And sometimes you have to trim back pretty good to get some of the dead part out of it or an infected part out of it so that the plant can grow, or that it doesn't get so full that you begin to get mold and mildew down in the middle of the plant. Oh, these things are bad, but you have to tend to it. Sometimes success seems easy, and other times it's a great, great, great aggravation and difficulty. I read this week the reason that so many of us buy mums and they never really come to flower is that mums take plenty of sunshine and lots of water and a lot of fertilizer really to make them pop. It's not just you forget about it. It's nurture and sustain it. The following after Jesus, the walking on the way of the kingdom, to follow after Him and to allow His love and His grace to transform our life isn't something that we can just do 1 hour on Sunday morning or once in a while. It's a regular old decision every day. Sometimes when we need it most and when we get most frustrated, that's the point where we need to just sit there a minute, pause, reflect on what's really important, and begin to go back again. The old classic story about Martin Luther, that he had so much to do, he took another extra hour in prayer that morning. How would our life be different if instead of trying to work harder or be better or succeed more in our lives, that we just took another extra hour or 30 minutes or 5.5 seconds more than we normally do in prayer, to allow God, to invite God again into our lives, to ask God to guide us, to help us reflect the kingdom of God in the world. Well, there's plenty of hurt and aggravation in the world, especially right now. But this inbreaking of the kingdom of God, this following after Christ, and this invitation to follow is always the hope and the trust in the future of grace ruling in the world and in our lives. There's always a chance for us. There's always a way for us to go forth into the world to be the saints that God needs in the world. Just you, me, us. Oh, this grace. This grace causes trouble in the way we see things, the way we understand things, and the way that we hope and we trust. May it always guide us and change us, give us hope, never leave us as we are, and call us to follow after Jesus. All glory, honor, and power be to the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.